We are finishing up our series in First John. This has been good for anybody? Anybody have fun? Learning to live in fellowship with God and with people. I think of this letter, and I think of John kind of coming towards the end of his life, and so often in this letter he's talking to his dear children or his just his friends in the faith that he's kind of been mentoring and helping along for years and years now. And I want us to think about today as we go through this, just the father heart of our big spiritual father, John, and just the love that he has for people, just even the way that he makes the letters really just try to be real simple in the way that we live out our faith. And so we're just going to hear one more message around some ideas from Papa John. That's I'm sorry, but too soon. Anyways, would you guys pray with me as we get started? God, we love you so much. We're so thankful for your presence here with us and for our opportunity to come and to be with you and to sit with you and to be around people who want to know more about you and live in a way that seeks after you. So God, we thank you for that. We thank you for everybody here who doesn't know you yet and or who's got questions. God, we thank you that you're not intimidated, but you're here to answer those, God. So we thank you for this time we get to share. We ask that you bless it and help us to make our lives look a little bit more like yours. In your name, amen. 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 Can we have a hand for the worship team as you guys have a seat? So good, so thankful that they come here every week and lead us right on into the presence of God. And such a valuable time for me and for my heart when we just get to come and let everything else just kind of fall away and just be with Jesus, you know? You feel me? Awesome. Well, I have a science experiment this morning. I don't always do this. Little known fact, I'm a physicist. Prove I'm not. All right. Horror vacui, I think is the Latin. We would say nature abhors a vacuum. So Aristotle was part of his teaching on physics. Nature abhors a vacuum. I'm not obviously a physicist, so that's about as deep as my knowledge goes. But I do know that I know how vacuums kind of work. So I learned a little bit more this morning, and from my friend Justin as we were setting all this up. And then so here's my best shot at this. So if we were to cover this and then find a way to suck the air out, what it would do is it would create a lot of pressure in here because it's trying to equalize the pressure outside and inside. That's the best I know. So basically, nothing in nature likes to be empty. That's a good way of saying that, maybe. And I know I have some high school teachers in here, and this is funny. So I have a plan. I have this little piece of paper, and start things on fire, and I have this egg. And so the egg does not fit in the milk bottle. But the idea is, because we're going to start a fire, put it in a jar, it's going to create, I guess it's going to speed up things inside of here, and then when we cover it, it's going to have higher pressure outside than inside because there'll be less inside because maybe the fire's burning it up, and if that sounds about right. And then, so the idea is that it should be able to pull the egg through. Now, I did this and I tested this because I need to prove to you and myself that nothing in nature likes to be empty. So, wish me luck. Can I get a drum roll? I don't like that piece of paper. I'm going to go with this one. All right. I didn't tell them I was going to start something on fire in their school. That went so much better than I thought it would. But the cool thing here is, it still is too big to fit out. See? I don't know how we're going to get that out of there. Maybe we'll just break the glass, but it's going to, I hope. Okay. That's not good. That makes more smoke. I almost started my kitchen on fire yesterday. This went way better today. Actually, I want you to be reminded of the egg in the milk jar, and now the wet egg in the milk jar. Nature abhors a vacuum, meaning nature doesn't like things to be empty. I would say this. I would say your heart is very much the same. Your heart will not be empty. What do I mean? When we were created by God with a space in our heart for worship. There will always be something on the throne in our heart. And if there's not, our heart begins to pull at things, whatever's close by, gravitate toward it, and start to worship it. So let's go to our verse here, 1 John chapter 5, verses 20 and 21. There it goes. Okay, I forgot to snap the first time. Okay, and we know that the Son of God has come and he's given us understanding so that we can know the true God. How many are thankful that Jesus came so we can know the true God? And now we live in fellowship with the true God because we live in fellowship with his Son, Jesus Christ. He's the only true God, and he is eternal life. In verse 21, this is the very, very last verse in this book. It is a teaching from John he was giving to people, and it's the very, very end of it. The last thing he wants us to know after everything else we've learned over the last 5 weeks is this. He says, "Dear children," Father John saying, "Dear children, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your heart." And when I thought of this, I was like, my goodness, horror vacui, like I think in Latin. I thought, as long as this water's here, I'm a little parched. I thought, my goodness, if God's not in the center, on the throne in our hearts, we're always looking for something to be on the center, on the throne of our hearts. And it works so much like this, that he's saying, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your heart. So if your heart's not full, maybe be really careful what you put near your heart. This works just kind of like our lungs. Whatever we're kind of like, you kind of breathe in. You're not like you're not like a vacuum in a sense. You're just kind of like making your lungs bigger. And because your lungs abhor a vacuum, you just kind of, your diaphragm pulls down, your lungs expand, and air goes in because there's nothing in there. Also, my dog abhors a vacuum. That's always like, she gets a little skittish. It's the egg in the bottle. It's a breath in our lungs. It's a God to our hearts. It's something to our hearts. When our hearts are empty is the place and the time where it seems like it's the hardest to stay away from things that might take God's place in our hearts. I would say it this way. I'd say we're designed to worship. You were made to worship, and you will always be worshiping something. I believe this is just true. That we all have something that we look for and that we give our worship to. And I want to give us a reminder here. For some of us who have never come to faith, this will be maybe a vision of your future. For some of us, this will be, unfortunately, a reminder of our past, and hopefully for most of us, though I fear for some of us, this will be kind of description of where we're at today. There's a life, I just want us to think about this life when God is on the center of our hearts. And we're just so in love with him. I remember when I was coming to faith and early on in my Christian life, and different seasons between then, where prayer, reading my Bible was so alive. Prayer was like, I cannot wait to get to the next prayer meeting. Worship, you'd come into worship, and who knows what's happening. The sound is going out. The band's not very good. Luckily, we don't have that problem here. You think of just a million things that could be going wrong. Your day was weird on the way in, the kids or whatever, or you woke up late and you just whatever. All the stuff that you get into worship, and you're just like, I'm here with Jesus. Just felt so good, felt so natural. This place where we're just like, I'm in this place that I should be. Sharing and talking about our faith is simple. And we just love, we get in the car, we turn on worship. I'm just thinking of these seasons where I'm just, man, so in love, so on fire maybe for God. And that's those seasons where God is on the centerpiece of our hearts. But it's so easy for us to not live there, to not stay there. And I think that's what John's warning is all about, is he's like, don't let other things come and take that place in your heart. And it's so easy to do, and it happens little by little. The love we had for Jesus dwarfs the love we have for Jesus. Our Bible reading, which was once so consistent and life-giving, is now dull and rare. We don't pray, though we talk about prayer. The form exists on the outside, but the love that once produced these forms has left them standing, but only as a monument to our past love. Later in a different book, John would write, he would say, remember your first love. Return to your first love. And I think it's so easy to move from this live, living, hope-filled, joy-filled, worship-filled relationship with God to a dusty old religion. I would say Christianity is not a dusty old religion from our parents' or grandparents' age to be grown out of culturally, but it's a living, breathing relationship of love and communion with a living God. We don't worship a religion. We don't worship the forms. We worship Jesus himself. And so I want to talk this morning about getting that back in place. How do we get that started again? And maybe if we've never been there, how do we get that going for the first time? And if we're there, how do we keep that fire going? And in order to do that, I have two words I want to kind of talk about and define here. And as we think about some of these things, are words that we probably wouldn't use in like a normal context. The first one is idol. Idol. So for somebody that John would be writing to, this would have been writing to these Christians in the city of Ephesus, which is a city in Bible times. I'm trying to think how much information is important here. I think that'll cover it. And they were what we would call like a pagan culture. So there was some Jews in the city, and there was fewer Christians, but some Christians in the city, and it was mostly pagan, meaning they had just a bunch of different gods, and they would worship them for different reasons. And because of the time in history that this was happening, there were mostly Roman gods, but still some like Greek gods kind of spattered in, and it was kind of like kind of whatever kind of god you would want. So you'd go down to the idol place, and depending on the city you were in, you go grab this idol made out of stone, and you would worship it as a god, or this one carved out of wood, and you'd go pay for it, put it on your shrine or whatever, and then you'd go worship these idols. And so in this passage here in 1 John 5, what was translated for the New Living Translation that we read is often is translated in other different translations from Greek into English as idols. So make sure you keep idols far from your heart. Anything that would take God's place or idol, keep it away from you. And so these are kind of the idols of that day. So as these readers were listening to this thing from John, this letter from John, they would have thought of these very physical idols as things that could take God's place in their hearts. And these idols are sort of interesting. And in Isaiah, God is talking through Isaiah to the people of Israel. And he's saying, I can't believe you're going after these gods. It was a tree in the forest. You cut it down. You carved it. And now you're worshiping this thing that you created. Doesn't that seem sort of backwards, at least a little crazy? And these are the idols that they would have been talking about. But for our intents and purposes, we also have things that take God's place in our hearts. This can be anything. This can be like things that we kind of all would say that's really not a very good God. Things like our sexuality, things like finances, things like maybe like a job or a career path. Really any of these things that you kind of say, oh my gosh, these people worship this thing, a sports team. And I'm from Green Bay. I'm not from Green Bay. I'm from Wisconsin. So I'm obviously a Packers fan. The G stands for God. So it's God's team, so it's cool. We're in it together. We're in it together. Me and Jesus pulling for Aaron Rodgers. These are things that take our hearts. But there's also good things in our life that God gives us as gifts, but then we turn into gods. So a lot of times, God will give us something really incredible, like God will give us a marriage. Now all of a sudden we have a marriage, and it's, oh, this is very great. And now we turn, but it doesn't take a big turn before we're like, all of a sudden, I'm living for my marriage. I'm living from my marriage. This thing that was a good gift from God has turned into a God for us. So to worship our marriage, worship our kids. God gives us these gifts of incredible things. We love our kids. I was telling somebody, I cannot even remember life without Leo, and I don't think I would want to. I love him so much, and I just sit there sometimes, I just stare at him, and I can't believe you're real, and I love him, but he's a really, really good gift, but he's a really bad God. Can you imagine? Happens all the time. Put our hopes in our kids. Put our hopes in our marriage. We put our hopes in our relationships with friends. We put our hopes in a church. Put our hopes in a pastor. We put our hopes in our small group leader. These are really, really good gifts from God, but they're really, really bad gods to be worshipped. This is what an idol is. And so for much of human history, people would take these things and they would personify them. So we had a fertility god or a war god, and all these things, that we worship those things through these idols. And so they would set them, and then they would worship them. And now we don't really personify them as much per se. We, in that strict sense of like a physical idol, but we still have a throne on our heart, and we still have to have something on it. And anything that's there, that's not God, is an idol. Amen. So that's idols. So anything, I would say that anything not God that fills the void in our hearts is an idol. More specifically, anything not God that we worship. Here's the second word. Worship. Again, sort of like a term that we don't really use outside of Christianity or outside of church, or I guess we use it outside of Christianity, just not outside of like a faith context. Worship. And certainly worship looks like what we did here this morning as we come together and we sing songs of worship. It's Romans 12, I believe, 12:1, don't quote me on that, it's Romans 12 something, talks about our spiritual acts of worship. These are the things we do to help the poor, declare the goodness of God, declare the righteousness of God, help a friend, be a listening ear, really just kind of be Jesus in the world. These things end up being our spiritual acts of worship. But how many know you can do all the worshipful things with the wrong spirit and it not be worship at all? I don't know about you, but I've gone through seasons in my life where I've come to church, sang the songs, but completely disconnected at the heart level from the God that I'm singing to. So that's not worship then. So it's not the acts themselves that are the worship. It's the heart, position, the whole life. It's our whole life. It's our head, our heart, and our hands that emanates from a life that has Jesus on the throne. So you can go get coffee with somebody and it be worship. As we bring glory and honor to Jesus. As we tell our story, we keep Jesus on our heart. It's a soul level thing that powers all of those other things. And so we need to do the external things for it to be worship, but we can't have it only be external. Does that make sense? Jesus said this. He said, he was talking to some Pharisees. He says, you are like whitewashed tombs. Meaning you're beautiful on the outside, but inside there's literally a dead person. He's talking to some of the Pharisees who had all the things right. They had all the worship things right on the outside, but they were dead on the inside. He says, I'm looking for people who worship in spirit and in truth. I'm looking for people who worship in spirit, deep connection with who God is and the truth of it, like who God is, connected at the heart level. And then we go from that place and we do those things on the outside. So we're worshiping then whatever at the core level we're connected with and agreeing with. Whatever that thing is that we've set on our heart, at the throne on our heart. That's what worship is. Worship is the life that comes out of the thing that sits on the throne in your heart. So you may be saying, well, you know what? I'm not worshiping any of that stuff. I don't worship my marriage. I'm single, or I don't have kids. I'm not worshiping that. I'm not worshiping my job. I'm not worshiping my video game. I'm not worshiping any of that stuff. Well, if God's not on your throne of your heart, something is. And it might just be you. And if you know anything about you, you know that you're not a good God either. Probably better than all the rest of us know that. I certainly, I know how big of a boondoggle I can make my life. And so I can't imagine. Is that the right word? Boondoggle? We're not supposed to say that? Is that a bad word? Is that a bad word? Say it again. So what I want to ask you is, where's your life coming from? The things you do, where is it coming from? Are you coming to church and serving because you want to be recognized? Are you giving in the offering because you want to give, because you want people to notice? That's living for you. I'm not saying don't do those things. I'm saying, where's that coming from? Worship is all about origin, where this comes from, what this goes to. So when John is saying, be careful what's on the throne of your heart, because only you can know that. And it can look right for a long time before it all falls apart. But only you can know where it's coming from. So my question to you this morning is, we're worshiping something. Your heart abhors a vacuum. There's something or someone there, and you're living for it. In your daily life, you're making the decisions to follow after that thing that sits on our hearts. So we defined idols now and worship, and in doing so, we've started to solve our issue of how do we keep a relationship with God from growing dull or seeming unimportant. Remember that in these lives, in these moments, it's not God that's changing. When we ebb and flow, when we burn hot for God and we live and we're full of passion for Him, or when we're far from that, it's not God that's changing. He's the same from everlasting to everlasting. He's never changed a day in His life. He's always been what He always will be. And it's so reassuring, and a little bit it's kind of frustrating, right? Because we can never blame God. We never get to say, well, God just hasn't been listening lately. I called 3 times, but He just didn't pick up His phone. It's on us. He's not changing. So what's changing about us? I think it's our worship. See, when we slow down our worship, when we stop worshiping, when we start worshiping something else, when we stop at the heart level connecting with the character of who God is and living from that place, that's when it all starts to fall apart. And it may look like different things. And that's when we start to slow down, and as we start to feel disconnected. And it may look like different things. It may look like I just don't really get anything out of worship anymore. They do the same songs all the time. Or I feel like every time I open my Bible, I'm just distracted. Or I feel like it can look like a million things. What it comes from is a core level at our hearts is that we've slowed down, we've given up. Our worship is where it starts. It starts in our worship. It starts in our hearts. It starts with the way that we esteem God in our souls. Worship is so important for our present because worship determines our future. What you worship determines your future. You are going to move in the direction of your worship. You're going to live into the direction of your worship. So if you're looking down, if you're worshiping Jesus and you're saying, I love that you're good, I love that you're kind, I love that you're forgiving and long-suffering, your life is going in that way. That's why we talk about Jesus as following the way. That's why we say we follow the way of Jesus, because it's a road and we just walk down this way and we follow the one that we worship. But if you're worshiping your finances, that's where your life is going. You're worshiping your kids, you're going to just get all wrapped up in that. And guess what? They're going to leave home someday. Nothing else is worth our worship. I would say this also, worship, you will grow in the direction of your worship, and worship builds your worldview. You begin to see your life through the lens of your worship. We do. We begin to see our life through the lens of our worship. So if we worship, if our worship is all about, if we're worshiping like a new house or a job or status, whatever that thing is, that kind of carries all of that kind of American dream thing, whatever that thing is, and we're worshiping that, we begin to see everything through the lens of, does this get me closer to that or further from that? So when we have like a problem with our wife and she's like, well, I need you to stay home. I'm very sick. The kids are very sick. And you're like, well, I have this big meeting. And now you're going to make a decision based on your worship, not based on what's right. And that we start to see through that lens. And if we're worshiping our kids, we start to see through the lens of how everything affects them and what we want from them, what we want for them, whatever that is. But if we have worship in our heart that's right, if we've got God on the throne, God in the center, and we're living that way, we start to see the world the way Jesus sees the world. That's what you want. He walked down the street and he said, my heart was filled with compassion as he looked out over people. Don't you want that? Don't we want to live full of compassion for people? I want to live and I want to see how Jesus lives and sees. And the only way we get to see is to be worship. We just agree, God, at the heart level, you're on the throne. Just connect with him. Spirit. We worship in spirit. We begin to see the way that God sees. Worship builds our worldview. I want to say nothing can take the place at the center of your heart. It has to be given. Nothing can take away the place that you've put God on in the center of your heart. So we don't have to be afraid of what's coming at us. If God is on the center and we've put him there, we're agreeing, like that's good, that's solid. He's protected that. That's called freedom. Jesus set us free from anything that would take us slave in that sense. But so nothing else can take that place from you. And God won't forcibly take that space in your heart. Nothing else can take it. And God won't take it. He wants to be invited. He doesn't want to control us. He wants people who have chosen to worship, chosen to be in a relationship, chosen to stay connected to him. And he will fight. He will protect us. He will keep everything that would fight, that would take that place over our hearts. He will fight it away. He'll keep it far from us. But we have to choose, continually choose, to keep God at the center, to keep our heart and our worship. I think about all these other things as the band comes up. I think of all these other things that we give our hearts to, that take place of our hearts. And I think, man, I just had this image, and as I was preparing, I actually just did this in my bedroom to see how weird this felt. But so many of us are living our life for money, and so I was thinking like how weird it would look if we just like got on our knees and began to worship like a big stack of cash. You're like, what? That's so weird, but we do it. Or like if your kids get home from school, they walk in the door and you're like, oh yes, you're finally home. You're like, what are we doing? And just the visual to me was just so stark. I was just like, oh, that's wrong. That thing is not worth my worship. And I began to think of like all the things that I would like rightly bend my knee to. I could think of only one. One thing that I would feel comfortable like bending my knee before. The one who from the beginning of time had me in mind. Knowing my sin and my failure and my shame. Came down on planet Earth. Lived the life I couldn't live. Died the death I should have died. Bore the wrath of God for me. Defeating death. I want to worship the one who can defeat death. And not just for himself, but the one who defeated death for me. Everything else is temporary. Everything else comes and goes with the stock market, with the years. Everything else is here today and gone tomorrow. But in 1 billion years, there will still be one worthy of the place on the throne of my heart. There's only Jesus. As we wrap up our series here, John is saying, listen, be really careful. These idols, these things in your life, they may look pretty, and sometimes they may even look powerful, but at the end of the day, it's a hunk of wood. It's a piece of stone. And it's going to get lost with history. There's one thing, one man who will sit on the throne of heaven over all the earth forever. There's one. He's the one that deserves to be on the throne of our hearts. And if we get our worship right, our life begins to go in that direction. This is the first step. And in some ways, is the only step. As we look and we esteem Jesus, who he is, we put him on the throne of our hearts, and we move and live that way. John is so concerned that we live in the light and not the dark. So he makes it easy the whole way. He says, God is love. God is light. Everything else is something else. There's one who deserves to be on the throne in our hearts. Everything else is just a log. It's just a rock.